Pen ink smells like copper and burnt plastic if you press your nose close enough to the paper. Elena didn't need to lean in to know that. The scent seemed to waft up from the crisp white document resting on the scarred surface of their IKEA dining table, cutting through the lingering smell of yesterday's garlic and stale coffee. David sat across from her, his posture impeccably straight. He wore the charcoal suit, the one they had saved up for months to buy when he finally landed his junior executive role at Hayes and Ford. Now the wool blended seamlessly into the gray afternoon light, filtering through the kitchen's single streaky window. He didn't look like a man dismantling a life. He looked like a man closing a mediocre quarterly review. "It's not about blame, Elena," David said. His voice was a flat, modulated baritone. He had spent the last 2 years perfecting that voice, stripping away the eager, slightly nasal pitch of the struggling grad student she had married. "It's about trajectories. We are simply moving in different directions." Elena stared at his tie. It was a muted navy silk. She remembered buying him novelty ties when they first met, ties with tiny coffee cups or dogs on them. He had thrown those out 6 months ago. She picked at the cuticle of her left thumb, her nail digging into the soft skin until a tiny sharp flare of pain blossomed. A bead of dark red blood welled up. She watched it, fascinated by the vividness of the color against her pale skin. "Trajectories," Elena repeated. The word tasted like tin in her mouth. "Yes." David tapped his Mont Blanc pen, a gift from his new managing partner, against the table. It made a sharp, impatient click-click. "I'm 32. I'm making partner in 2 years. I need a partner who aligns with that reality. You're content stocking shelves at the bookstore, painting in the spare room, living paycheck to paycheck. There's no ambition there. I can't keep carrying the weight of our future alone." He was looking at her faded, oversized sweater, the one with a frayed hem hanging off her left shoulder. He was looking at her unvarnished nails, her messy bun held together by a cheap plastic clip. He was looking at her with an emotion she finally recognized, and it felt like a physical blow to the sternum. Pity. He pitied her. Elena didn't scream. She didn't throw the half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee at his perfectly groomed head. The urge was there, a hot, bright spark in her chest, but it was instantly smothered by a cold, suffocating blanket of exhaustion. She had spent 5 years playing this part, dulling her edges, shrinking herself down to fit into this cramped, damp-smelling apartment, all because David had felt safe. He had felt normal. He was a man who worried about electric bills and broken radiators, a man utterly detached from the sprawling, suffocating trillion-dollar empire she had fled. She had loved him for his mediocrity, and now he was leaving her for lacking it. "Is it Chloe?" Elena asked. Her voice was quiet, stripped of any accusatory heat. David's jaw twitched, a microscopic break in the facade. "Chloe is a colleague, but yes, she understands the demands of my world. Her father is on the board. She gets it, Elena. She speaks the language. You freeze up at corporate dinners. You wore thrifted vintage to the winter gala." "It was Chanel," Elena murmured automatically, though the irony was entirely lost on him. It had been an original 1980s piece from her mother's archived closet, worth more than David's entire stock portfolio. It looked old. David snapped, his patience finally fraying. He pushed the divorce papers an inch closer to her. The page demanded her signature. "I've been generous. I'm leaving you the apartment, and I'll pay the rent through the end of the year. I've also deposited $20,000 into our joint account. That's more than fair considering you haven't contributed to the savings in 3 years. $20,000. Elena almost laughed. The sound got stuck in her throat, morphing into a dry, hollow rattle. He was buying his freedom, paying off his guilt with a sum of money her grandfather spent on premium jet fuel for a weekend trip to Geneva. "Just sign it, Elena. Let's not make this messy. I have a flight to Chicago in 3 hours." She looked up, really looked at him. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by this polished, hollow shell. There was no warmth in his hazel eyes, only the restless, hungry calculation of a man climbing a ladder that had no top. Elena took the heavy pen from his outstretched hand. The metal was warm from his grip. She didn't read the clauses. She didn't care about the apartment with its rattling pipes, or the $20,000 that David thought was a king's ransom. She pressed the nib to the paper and signed her name in a smooth, looping script. Elena Miller. For the last time. David exhaled a long breath of pure relief. He pulled the papers back, his movements brisk and efficient. He slid them into a sleek leather briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut. The sound was final, a guillotine dropping. "Thank you," he said, standing up and smoothing his jacket. "I'll send movers for the rest of my things on Tuesday. Keep the keys. Take care of yourself, Elena." He didn't try to hug her. He didn't linger. He turned and walked down the short hallway. The front door opened, letting in a gust of damp city air, and then closed with a solid, echoing thud. Elena sat perfectly still. The refrigerator hummed its rattling off-key tune. A siren wailed faintly in the distance. The apartment was entirely hers now, and it had never felt smaller. Silence has a texture. In the aftermath of David's departure, the silence in the apartment felt thick and gritty, like dust settling on wet paint. Elena remained at the table for an hour, watching the blood on her thumb dry into a dark, rusty flake. The numbness began to recede, leaving behind a raw, throbbing ache. It wasn't just the loss of David, it was the humiliation. She had bent over backwards to be the unassuming, supportive wife. She had bitten her tongue when he complained about her lack of drive. She had smiled apologetically when his wealthy friends made condescending remarks about her bookstore job. She had endured the crushing boredom of his corporate dinners, pretending to be dazzled by men talking about six-figure bonuses, all while holding a secret that could have bought and sold the entire restaurant without a second thought. And it hadn't been enough. She had sacrificed her identity to be normal, and normal had rejected her. Elena stood up. Her legs felt stiff, like they belonged to someone else. She walked into the bedroom. David's closet was half empty. He had taken the suits, the expensive shoes, the watch winder. He had left behind the worn-out jeans, the faded t-shirts, the detritus of the man he used to be. She walked over to her side of the room. A small, battered wooden jewelry box sat on the dresser. It held cheap silver rings, a few tangled necklaces, and a pair of pearl earrings she claimed were knockoffs. She opened it, not looking at the jewelry. Instead, she pressed her thumbs against the velvet lining of the bottom tray and pushed hard. With a soft click, the false bottom popped loose. Underneath lay a heavy matte black card. No name, no title. Just a 10-digit phone number embossed in silver and a single stylized crest, a falcon perched on a globe. The insignia of the Vanderkamp family. Elena ran her thumb over the raised silver numbers. 5 years ago, she had walked out of her grandfather's sprawling estate in the Hamptons with nothing but a backpack and a fake last name. She had been suffocated by the golden cage, terrified of becoming like her mother, a brilliant, ruthless woman who had traded her soul for market shares and died cold and alone in a clinical hospital room. Elena had wanted love. She had wanted struggle. She had wanted reality. "You'll be back," her grandfather, Arthur Vanderkamp, had rasped, sitting in his leather wingback chair, smelling of aged scotch and absolute power. "The world is a harsh place for people who bleed easily, Elena. You are a Vanderkamp. You don't survive out there. You conquer, or you come home." She had proved him wrong. She had survived. But David had just shown her the fatal flaw in her plan. If you pretend to be a mouse, eventually someone is going to treat you like one, and they won't even feel bad when they step on you. Elena felt a sudden violent surge of nausea. She stumbled to the tiny tiled bathroom and gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, dry heaving until her throat burned. When she looked up, her reflection stared back from the water-spotted mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale and drawn. She looked like exactly what David said. She was a worn-out, uninspired woman fading into the background. "No," she whispered. The word sounded raspy, foreign. She walked back to the bedroom, picked up her cheap Android phone, and dialed the number on the black card. It rang only once. "Direct line," a voice answered. It was crisp, deeply resonant, and entirely devoid of inflection. "Thomas," Elena said. Her voice shook just a fraction. A heavy pause hung on the line. Then the tone shifted, softening imperceptibly. "Miss Elena, it has been a considerable amount of time." "It has." Elena swallowed hard, tasting the bitter remnants of bile in the back of her throat. "Is the offer still open?" "The seat at the head of the board has remained empty per your grandfather's instructions. He assumed you were merely taking a prolonged sabbatical." "I need an extraction," Elena said, the corporate terminology slipping back onto her tongue as easily as a second language. "I'm in Brooklyn, the apartment on 4th and Elm." "Understood." "Are there any loose ends that require management?" Thomas asked smoothly. Elena looked at the empty space in David's closet. She thought of the $20,000 he had left her like a tip on a dinner table. She thought of Chloe, the board member's daughter, who spoke the language. A cold, hard knot began to form in her chest, replacing the grief with something sharper, something metallic. "Just one," Elena said softly. "But I'll manage it myself. Just send the car, Thomas." "We will be there in 20 minutes, Miss Elena. Welcome back." The line went dead. Elena dropped the phone onto the bed. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't take the cheap clothes or the faded sweaters. She walked into the living room, stood before the IKEA table, and stared at the spot where the divorce papers had been. David wanted a partner who understood trajectories. He wanted power. He had thrown her away because he thought she had none. Elena smiled. It was a terrifying, jagged thing that didn't reach her eyes. "You want the top of the food chain, David," she thought, the cynical, ruthless Vanderkamp blood finally waking up in her veins, running like ice water. "I'm going to show you exactly who owns the ladder." The rain had intensified, turning the Brooklyn streets into slick, oily mirrors, reflecting the neon glow of corner bodegas. Elena stood under the meager awning of her apartment building, the damp chill seeping through her thin cardigan. She had nothing in her hands, no purse, no keys. She had locked the door and slid the key under the mat. A sleek midnight black Maybach glided to a halt at the curb, its engine a barely perceptible purr beneath the sound of the rain. The vehicle looked entirely alien against the backdrop of overflowing trash cans and graffitied brick walls. It was a predator resting in an alleyway. Before the car had even fully settled, the rear door swung open. A man stepped out, unfurling a massive black umbrella in one fluid motion. Thomas hadn't aged a day in 5 years. His silver hair was perfectly cropped, his dark suit tailored to millimeter perfection. He smelled of starch rain and the faint ozone scent of a concealed firearm. "Miss Elena," he said, holding the umbrella over her. His eyes, a pale, unreadable blue, scanned her thoroughly, but respectfully taking in the frayed sweater and the exhaustion bracketing her mouth. He offered no pity, only protocol. "Hello, Thomas," Elena replied. She stepped out from under the awning and into the shelter of his umbrella. As she slid into the cavernous rear of the Maybach, the transition was violently abrupt. The smell of damp garbage and exhaust vanished, replaced by the intoxicating aroma of rich, supple leather and subtle cedar. The heavy door closed with a muffled thud, instantly severing the noise of the city. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. It was the expensive insulated silence of a world where consequences didn't exist. Elena sank into the heated seat, closing her eyes as the car smoothly pulled away from the curb. She felt a strange dual sensation, a profound aching loss for the simple life she was leaving behind, and an undeniable dark thrill as the immense weight of her heritage settled back onto her shoulders. "Your grandfather was pleased to receive the news," Thomas said from the front seat, the privacy partition lowered just enough for his voice to carry. "He is currently at the Manhattan penthouse. We are heading there now." "How is his health?" Elena asked, staring out the tinted window as the gritty storefronts of Brooklyn blurred past. "Failing, but he refuses to acknowledge it," Thomas replied smoothly. "His primary concern has been the upcoming merger with Hayes and Ford. The negotiations require a delicate touch." Elena's head snapped toward the partition. Her heart skipped a beat, then slammed against her ribs. "Hayes and Ford." "Yes, a mid-tier wealth management firm. Your grandfather intends to acquire them to bolster our subsidiary holding portfolios. Is there an issue, Miss Elena?" Elena let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. The universe had a deeply twisted sense of humor. Hayes and Ford, David's firm. The firm he was willing to throw away his marriage for just to secure a junior partnership. He was climbing a mountain entirely unaware that Elena's family owned the tectonic plates beneath it. "No issue," Thomas. Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the soft, accommodating lilt she had used for the last 5 years. It grew flat smooth and dangerously sharp. "Actually, it's perfectly timed. Tell my grandfather I want point on the acquisition." Thomas glanced at her through the rearview mirror. A ghost of a smile touched his thin lips. "Of course. I will prepare the briefing documents for your arrival." The Maybach merged onto the bridge, the glittering skyline of Manhattan rising before them like a fortress of glass and steel. It was a city Elena had once run from, terrified of its teeth. Now she felt its rhythm syncing with her own pulse. When they arrived at the underground private garage of the Vanderkamp Tower, an elevator whisked them directly to the penthouse on the 72nd floor. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling expanse of white marble, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, and the imposing skeletal figure of Arthur Vanderkamp. He was leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane silhouetted against the city lights. He turned as Elena stepped into the room. He didn't rush to embrace her. He simply studied her, his pale eyes piercing through the cheap sweater and the messy hair. "You look like a peasant," Arthur rasped his voice, sounding like dry leaves crushing together. "Hello to you too, grandfather," Elena replied, refusing to look away. Arthur's mouth twitched. "You've lost that foolish softness in your eyes." "Good. What changed?" I learned a lesson about investments, Elena said, walking slowly toward him, the plush carpeting absorbing the sound of her cheap sneakers. I invested heavily in a low-yield asset. It depreciated. Arthur let out a dry, barking laugh. And now I liquidate. Elena stood before the old man. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel intimidated by his vast shadow. She felt like she belonged in it. I want the Hayes and Ford acquisition. I want full autonomy. Arthur's eyes narrowed, gleaming with sudden predatory interest. They are a stubborn firm. The board is resisting the buyout. They won't, Elena said, thinking of David, thinking of his perfectly tailored suit and his arrogant, hollow eyes. Give me 3 days. I'll bring them to their knees. Arthur stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then he raised his cane and pointed it toward the hallway. There is a wardrobe prepared in your suite. A stylist is waiting. Wash the poverty off yourself, Elena. If you are going to slaughter pigs, you don't do it wearing rags. Elena didn't flinch. She nodded once, turning on her heel. An hour later, Elena stood before a massive trifold mirror in her suite. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable. The messy bun was gone, replaced by a sleek, sharp blowout that fell like dark silk around her shoulders. The thrifted sweater was discarded. In its place, she wore a custom-tailored bone-white Alexander McQueen suit that fit her like a second skin. It was armor. It felt heavy, restrictive, and incredibly powerful. She lifted a hand, inspecting her nails. The stylist had cleaned away the dried blood and filed them into immaculate sharp points painted a deep, glossy crimson. Elena leaned close to the glass. The heartache was still there, a dull throb beneath her ribs, but it was encased in ice now. David Miller had ended a marriage to a barista in cold blood, seeking a woman who spoke the language of power. You wanted a monster? David. Elena thought, her crimson lips curving into a cold, beautiful smile. Congratulations. You created one. She turned away from the mirror and walked out the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor like the ticking of a bomb. Conference room air always smells like recycled anxiety and lemon polish. Elena sat at the head of the sprawling mahogany table, her manicured fingers resting lightly on the leather binding of a prospectus. For 3 days she had buried herself in the financial guts of Hayes and Ford. She had dissected their offshore holdings, their inflated asset valuations, and the precarious house of cards holding up their quarterly projections. Richard Hayes, the founding partner, sat 2 chairs down, sweating through his custom-tailored Egyptian cotton shirt. He was a man accustomed to making people wait, a man who viewed himself as a titan of Wall Street. Right now, he looked like a cornered badger. Miss Vanderkamp. Hayes began, his voice lacking its usual booming resonance. He cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. The initial offer your grandfather tabled was aggressive, but this revised structure, you're asking us to dissolve our executive board and surrender voting rights entirely. That's not a merger, that's a slaughter. Elena didn't look at him immediately. She turned a page in the prospectus. The paper was thick, expensive. It made a soft, sibilant whisper against the heavy silence of the room. She was exhausted. A dull ache throbbed behind her left eye, a phantom hangover from the emotional whiplash of the past 72 hours. But she couldn't show it. The bone-white McQueen suit demanded perfect posture. Mr. Hayes. Elena finally said, her voice dropping into the quiet, flat cadence of her grandfather. It was a terrifying parlor trick she didn't know she possessed until she needed it. You are over-leveraged in commercial real estate by 30%. Your top-performing fund is bleeding capital to a boutique firm in London. You aren't in a position to negotiate the color of the life raft, let alone who gets to row. She tapped her pen, a matte black stylus, utterly unpretentious and lethal, against the table. Click, click. She remembered David tapping his Mont Blanc pen on their cheap IKEA table. The memory didn't burn anymore. It just felt cold. We have other buyers, a younger partner, a man named Campbell interjected. He was trying to sound defiant, but his eyes kept darting to Thomas, who stood immovably by the frosted glass doors like a marble gargoyle. No, you don't, Elena replied, sliding a slim gray folder across the polished wood. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Vanderkamp Holdings purchased the debt on your primary credit lines. If you reject this buyout, I will call the loans in by Friday. Your stock will tank, your clients will flee, and this firm will be sold for scrap metal. Hayes stared at the folder. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The blood drained from his face, leaving his heavily tanned skin looking like bruised fruit. He looked at Elena, searching her face for a trace of bluff, a flicker of mercy. He found nothing but the flat, dead-eyed calm of an apex predator. Elena felt a sickening flutter in her stomach. It was the ghost of the woman who used to apologize for taking up too much space on the subway, the woman who worried about hurting people's feelings. She ruthlessly suffocated that ghost. This wasn't cruelty, she told herself. This was arithmetic. You have until tomorrow evening at the firm's anniversary gala to sign the transfer documents, Elena said, standing up. The chair slid back silently on the thick carpet. I expect a public announcement by 9. Have a pleasant afternoon, gentlemen. She walked out of the room, Thomas opening the door a split second before she reached it. As she stepped into the hallway, the facade almost cracked. Her knees felt suddenly hollow, a trembling weakness invading her joints. She leaned heavily against the cold glass of the elevator bay, closing her eyes. Breathe, Miss Elena, Thomas said softly, his voice devoid of judgment. I'm fine. She lied the words, tasting like copper. She opened her eyes, watching the floor numbers descend on the digital display. Thomas ensure the junior executives are present at the gala tomorrow, all of them, including Mr. Miller. Especially Mr. Miller. Elena smoothed the front of her jacket. The trembling stopped. The ice took over again. He values trajectories, Thomas. It's only fair I show him where his is heading. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Pierre Hotel ballroom, blurring the city lights into smeared, glittering streaks of gold and red. Inside, the air was thick with the clinking of crystal flutes, the heavy scent of orchids, and the desperate humming energy of a company trying to pretend it wasn't standing on a trap door. David adjusted his cuffs, pulling them down just enough to show the edge of his new Rolex, a congratulatory gift to himself for his impending junior partnership. He felt a tight buzzing anxiety in his chest. The rumors had been flying around the bullpen all day. A hostile takeover. The Vanderkamp family. The name alone was enough to make senior partners speak in hushed, terrified whispers. Beside him, Chloe laughed at a joke a managing director made. She looked flawless in a slinky emerald gown, her blonde hair catching the chandelier light. She belonged here. She was the right choice. David squeezed her hand, trying to anchor himself in his own narrative. He had cut the dead weight. He was ascending. I heard the Vanderkamp representative is here, Chloe murmured, leaning close, her perfume a sharp, aggressive mix of jasmine and bergamot. My father says they're going to gut the C-suite. It might actually open up a faster track for you, David. Let's hope, David said, taking a long sip of his gin martini. The alcohol burned the back of his throat, a welcome distraction from the gnawing unease. He scanned the room, watching the crowd part near the grand entrance. A sudden heavy silence rippled outward, swallowing the ambient chatter. People were stepping back, their eyes wide, their expressions a mix of awe and naked fear. David followed their gaze. A woman was walking down the short flight of velvet-carpeted stairs. She wore a floor-length gown, the color of an oil, slick, a deep iridescent black that seemed to swallow the light around it. Her hair was pulled back into a severe architectural style that exposed the sharp line of her jaw and a necklace of diamonds that looked heavy enough to bruise her collarbone. She moved with an eerie, frictionless grace, flanked by a massive gray-haired bodyguard and followed by a trailing wake of terrified senior partners, including Richard Hayes himself, who looked like a man being led to the gallows. David's breath hitched. His brain stuttered, refusing to process the incoming data. It was Elena. It couldn't be Elena. The woman walking toward the center of the ballroom looked like a weapon forged from ice and wealth. Elena was soft. Elena wore oversized sweaters and smelled of cheap vanilla lotion and old paperbacks. This woman smelled of power and ozone. But it was her face. The same high cheekbones, the same dark, intelligent eyes. Except those eyes were currently sweeping over the room with a cold, terrifying indifference that David had never seen before. Panic, hot and irrational, flared in David's chest. What was she doing here? Did she snap? Did she follow him? Oh God, she had somehow gotten in to cause a scene. She was going to embarrass him in front of the entire firm, in front of Chloe's father. "Excuse me," David muttered to Chloe, pulling his hand from hers. He pushed his way through the crowd, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He intercepted her just as she reached the edge of the VIP lounge area, stepping directly into her path. "Elena," David hissed, keeping his voice low, his face flushing dark red. "What the hell are you doing here? Are you insane?" Thomas immediately stepped forward, his hand slipping inside his suit jacket, but Elena held up a single pale finger. The bodyguard froze, retreating a half step. Elena looked at David. She didn't look angry. She didn't look heartbroken. She looked at him the way a pedestrian looks at a piece of chewing gum stuck to their shoe, a mild, fleeting annoyance. "David," she said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, carrying just enough for the surrounding circle of executives to hear. It lacked any of the warmth he remembered. "You need to leave," David demanded, his voice trembling with suppressed rage and embarrassment. He grabbed her arm. It was a fatal mistake. Before David could blink, Thomas had a grip on David's wrist that felt like an industrial vice. Pain shot up David's forearm, forcing a sharp gasp from his lungs. Thomas twisted, forcing David to his knees on the plush carpet. "Do not touch Miss Vanderkamp," Thomas stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. The ballroom went dead silent. The string quartet stopped playing. "Let him go, Thomas," Elena said softly. Thomas released David's wrist. David scrambled backward, clutching his arm, his face pale with shock. He looked up, expecting to see pity or horror on Elena's face. Instead, Richard Hayes pushed his way to the front, his face slick with sweat. He didn't look at David. He looked at Elena, bowing his head slightly. "Miss Vanderkamp," Hayes stammered. "I apologize. Mr. Miller is a junior associate. He doesn't understand the protocol." David felt the floor drop out from under him. The room spun. The crystal chandeliers blurred into streaks of blinding light. Miss Vanderkamp. The name echoed in his skull like a gunshot. Elena looked down at him. The silence stretched tight as a piano wire. "It's quite all right, Richard," Elena said, her voice echoing in the massive room. She didn't break eye contact with David. "Mr. Miller and I are acquainted. He was just explaining to me the other day about the importance of trajectories. Isn't that right, David?" David opened his mouth, but his throat was completely dry. No sound came out. He looked at Chloe, who was standing a few feet away, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with horror as she looked at her father, who was glaring at David with pure, undisguised hatred. David choked out. "Stand up, David," Elena commanded softly. It wasn't a request. David scrambled to his feet, his tailored suit suddenly feeling cheap and constricting. He felt naked. Every eye in the room was skinning him alive. Elena stepped closer to him. The scent of her, something custom and deeply expensive, sharp as broken glass, overwhelmed him. "You wanted to climb the ladder," she murmured. Her voice meant only for him now. "You should have checked who owned the building first." She turned away, dismissing him entirely, and walked into the VIP lounge. The crowd swallowed her up, leaving David standing alone in the center of the room, a ghost in a charcoal suit. 3 weeks later, the acquisition was finalized. The bloodbath was meticulous and quiet. The Hayes and Ford name was scraped off the glass doors of the skyscraper, replaced by a sleek, understated Vanderkamp Holdings subsidiary group. Elena sat in the massive corner office that used to belong to Richard Hayes. The view of the skyline was identical to the one her grandfather had just 30 stories lower. It was raining again. The drops hitting the thick glass sounded like a ticking clock. Her desk was clear, save for a single manila folder. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Thomas stepped in. "He is here, Miss Elena." "Send him in." David walked into the office. He looked 10 years older. The arrogant posture was gone, replaced by a slight defeated slump. His eyes had dark rings under them, and the sharp lines of his face had softened into something haggard and lost. He was holding a cheap cardboard box containing a framed photo of a boat. He didn't own a pair of noise-canceling headphones and his Mont Blanc pen. Chloe's father had fired him 2 days after the gala, a desperate attempt to appease the new Vanderkamp overlords. It hadn't saved the firm, but it had ruined David. Chloe had blocked his number the same night. Elena looked at him. She searched herself for the petty, vindictive thrill of triumph. She dug deep into her chest, looking for the spark of joy at seeing the man who broke her reduced to this. She found nothing, just a hollow, echoing sadness. Not for him, but for the girl who had loved him, the girl who had died on an IKEA dining table over a $20,000 bribe. "Sit down, David," Elena said, pointing to the leather chair opposite her desk. David sat. He placed the cardboard box on his lap, clutching it like a shield. He looked at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "I don't expect you to apologize," Elena started, her voice flat. "This isn't a dramatic reunion. This is an exit interview." David laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "An exit interview, right, because firing me wasn't enough. You had to bring me up here to gloat." "I didn't fire you, David. Richard Hayes fired you to save his own skin," Elena corrected smoothly. "I brought you here to finalize the paperwork." She tapped the manila folder. David finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a toxic mix of resentment and profound regret. "Why didn't you tell me 5 years, Elena? We were married. We shared a bed. How could you lie to me for 5 years?" "I didn't lie about who I was," Elena said, leaning forward, resting her arms on the desk. "I cooked your meals. I listened to your complaints. I supported you when you failed the Series 7 exam twice. That was all real. The money was the only thing I hid. And I hid it because I wanted to know you loved me for me, not for a bank routing number. That's insane. David snapped a flicker of his old arrogance surfacing. You played a game with my life. You let me stress over rent, over bills. I let you live in the real world. Elena interrupted, her voice rising just a fraction, a crack of thunder in the quiet room. I wanted a partner. You wanted an accessory. The moment you got a taste of power, you looked at me and saw a liability. You didn't care about the woman who loved you. You cared that my sweater was frayed and my nails weren't painted. David flinched, the words striking him like physical blows. He looked down at his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the cardboard box. I made a mistake, he whispered. It was the truest thing he had said in years. Yes, Elena agreed softly. You did. She opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, along with a heavy Vanderkamp-branded pen. What's this? David asked, his voice hoarse. More divorce papers. Severance, Elena said. Standard package for junior executives terminated during an acquisition. 6 months salary. Continued health benefits through the end of the year. David stared at the paper. It was a lifeline. He was drowning in debt, his rent was due, and he had been blacklisted from every major firm in the city. He needed the money desperately, but as he reached for the pen, he paused. He looked at Elena, the woman in the bone-white suit, the trillionaire heir, who owned the air he was breathing. He realized the most agonizing truth of all. She wasn't giving him the severance out of lingering love. She wasn't doing it out of spite. She was doing it because it was protocol. He was just a line item on a balance sheet. He meant absolutely nothing to her. David picked up the pen. His hand shook as he signed his name. David Miller. He pushed the paper back across the desk. He stood up, clutching his cardboard box. Elena, he said, pausing at the door. He didn't turn around. Did you ever plan to tell me? Elena looked at the wet signature on the paper. The ink smelled like copper and burnt plastic. I was going to tell you the night you left. Elena said, her voice barely louder than the rain against the glass. I had the trust documents in my bag. I was going to pay off your student loans for your birthday. David's shoulders dropped. A ragged, awful sound escaped his throat, a sob he choked back down instantly. He opened the door and walked out, letting it click shut behind him. Elena sat in the silence of the massive office. She was the victor. She had conquered the mountain. She had survived the real world just as her grandfather demanded. She picked up the severance document, placed it in her outbox, and turned her chair to face the window, watching the gray, weeping city below. She was finally at the top of the ladder, and she had never felt so entirely, utterly alone. Oxygen concentrators possess a distinct synthetic rhythm. Hiss, click, whir, sigh. Elena sat in the wingback chair next to the sprawling 4-poster bed, listening to the machine force air into her grandfather's failing lungs. Dust motes drifted through a single beam of late afternoon sunlight that managed to pierce the heavy velvet drapes of the Hamptons estate. The room smelled of old paper, expensive lemon oil polish, and the faint sour odor of dying tissue. It was the scent of a kingdom in decay. Arthur Vanderkamp looked incredibly small. Without his custom-tailored suits and the imposing architecture of his mahogany desk, he was just a fragile collection of brittle bones wrapped in translucent liver-spotted skin. "You hesitate," Arthur rasped. It wasn't a question. He didn't have the breath for inquiries. He was staring at the ceiling, his pale eyes milky, but still sharp enough to cut. Elena looked down at the iPad resting in her lap. On the screen was the final liquidation order for a massive manufacturing plant in Ohio, a subsidiary of the Hayes and Ford acquisition. Signing it meant optimizing the portfolio by 12%. It also meant 3,000 people would lose their pensions just weeks before the holidays. "I'm reviewing the severance structures," Elena said. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, smooth measured, entirely devoid of the anxious tremor that used to live in her throat. Arthur let out a sound that was half cough, half laugh. It rattled wetly in his chest. "Severance. You still think you can buy a clean conscience, Elena. It doesn't work. The money is just dirt. We pile it up to stand taller than everyone else, but underneath it's all just dirt." He slowly turned his head to look at her. The oxygen cannula pressed into his cheekbones. "I saw the report on the Miller boy. You gave him a golden parachute." Elena stiffened. She hadn't tried to hide it, but the fact that Arthur had tracked a low-level severance package meant he was watching her for weakness. It was standard protocol for a junior executive. "It was a toll," Arthur corrected his voice, dropping to a gravelly whisper. "A toll you paid to cross the bridge and leave your guilt on the other side. But you didn't leave it, did you? You dragged it right into this room." Elena set the iPad face down on the bedside table. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. The bone-white McQueen suit she had worn for weeks had been replaced by a heavy charcoal cashmere sweater and black slacks. She looked like a shadow sitting in the corner of the room. "He was collateral damage, grandfather. I neutralized the threat. I took the firm. I did exactly what you raised me to do. You did it out of spite." Arthur wheezed his frail hand, gripping the edge of the blanket. The knuckles were stark white. "Spite is a powerful fuel, Elena, but it burns dirty. It leaves soot in the engine. You wanted to hurt him because you still cared that he hurt you." Elena closed her eyes. The phantom ache in her sternum, the one that had been dull and distant since the day she signed the divorce papers, suddenly flared hot and bright. He was right. She had annihilated David's career, stripped him of his ambition, and cast him out into the cold. But sitting in her 72nd floor penthouse, eating meticulously plated meals prepared by a private chef, she didn't feel victorious. She just felt numb. The silence she had shared with David in their cramped Brooklyn apartment had been filled with the friction of two people trying to survive. The silence in her life now was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of her lungs. "How do you stop caring?" Elena asked softly. It was a genuine question, stripped of all corporate armor. It was the plea of a terrified 30-year-old woman asking a dying monster how to survive the dark. Arthur closed his eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the mechanical hiss-whir of the oxygen machine. "You don't," Arthur finally whispered, his voice so quiet Elena had to lean in to hear it. "You just learn to tolerate the cold. You build the walls so thick that by the time the caring tries to reach you, it freezes to death." He didn't speak again. The rhythm of his breathing slowed, growing shallower, fighting a losing battle against the fluid filling his lungs. Elena sat with him for 3 hours, watching the beam of sunlight crawl across the Persian rug, climb the wall, and finally fade into a bruised purple twilight. When the monitors attached to his chest finally emitted a flat, unbroken tone, Elena didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She calmly stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from her slacks, and pressed the call button for the private nursing staff. She walked out of the bedroom and down the sprawling curved staircase of the estate. Thomas was waiting in the grand foyer, standing motionless by the massive oak doors. He took one look at her face and gave a single slow nod of comprehension. "The board?" Thomas asked quietly. "Notify them," Elena said, her voice dropping into the absolute flat cadence of the dead man upstairs. "Arthur Vanderkamp has passed. Convene an emergency meeting for 7 a.m. tomorrow. I want the transition locked down before the markets open in Tokyo." "Understood, Miss Elena." She walked past him, stepping out into the biting chill of the evening air. The wind coming off the Atlantic was brutal, carrying the scent of salt and crushed shells. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. She had the crown now. The entire crushing weight of the trillion-dollar empire was resting solely on her shoulders. She looked up at the darkened windows of the estate. She had wanted power to ensure no one could ever make her feel small again. But looking at the vast empty sky, Elena realized she hadn't just built a fortress. She had locked herself in a velvet coffin. Rain is a necessary prop for a billionaire's funeral. If it doesn't rain naturally, one almost expects the estate managers to hire cloud seeders to ensure the proper somber aesthetic. Fortunately for the Vanderkamp Trust, the November sky over the private family cemetery in upstate New York provided a natural freezing downpour. Elena stood at the edge of the open grave, entirely encased in a custom Dior coat that felt heavier than chainmail. Above her, Thomas held a massive black umbrella, the rain drumming a chaotic, violent beat against the taut nylon. Behind her stood a sea of black umbrellas, hiding the faces of 300 of the most powerful people on the planet. Governors, tech magnates, foreign dignitaries, and rival hedge fund managers. None of them were crying. They were calculating. They were watching the young pale woman standing at the head of the grave, trying to gauge if her grief was a weakness they could exploit on Monday morning. The priest droned on his words, swallowed by the wind and the rain. Elena barely heard him. She was staring down at the polished mahogany casket. It looked remarkably small down there in the mud. Arthur had spent 80 years terrifying the global markets, bending governments to his will and hoarding wealth that rivaled small nations. Now he was taking up exactly 6 feet of wet earth, just like the poorest man in Brooklyn. As the priest threw the ceremonial handful of dirt onto the lid, a dull, hollow thud that echoed in Elena's chest, she turned away. She didn't wait for the handshakes. She didn't wait for the murmured, insincere condolences. She walked straight through the parting sea of black umbrellas, her heels sinking slightly into the sodden grass, until she reached the idling Maybach at the edge of the path. Once inside, the heavy doors sealed her away from the noise, the cold, and the predatory stares. She sank back into the leather, pulling off her black leather gloves, finger by finger. Thomas slid into the driver's seat, the privacy partition already lowered. "Back to the penthouse, Miss Elena. The legal team is waiting to finalize the probate transfers." Elena looked out the tinted window at the blurred gray landscape. She thought of the stacks of paper waiting for her. The ledgers, the acquisition reports, the endless rows of numbers that dictated the lives of millions of people she would never meet. "No," Elena said softly. "Drive to Brooklyn, Thomas. Take the Manhattan Bridge." Thomas paused, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. He didn't ask questions. "Yes, ma'am." The drive took 2 hours in the miserable weather. As the sleek Maybach crossed the river and descended into the gritty, cramped streets of her former life, Elena felt a strange, suffocating tightness in her throat. They turned down Elm Street. The sidewalks were cracked, the overflowing trash cans plastered with wet autumn leaves. It looked exactly the same, yet entirely alien. "Pull over here," Elena murmured. The car glided to a halt across the street from her old apartment building. The brick was stained black from the rain. She looked up at the third-floor window, the window of the kitchen where David had handed her the divorce papers. The lights were on. Through the streaky glass, Elena could see movement. A young woman with messy curly hair was standing at a familiar IKEA table laughing. A moment later, a man stepped into the frame. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt. He wrapped his arms around the woman from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. They were looking down at something on the table, maybe a bill, maybe a takeout menu. Whatever it was, they were facing it together. Elena pressed her gloved hand against the cold, tinted glass of the car window. A jagged, breathless sound tore out of her throat. It wasn't a sob. It was the sound of a structural collapse. She had given up that cramped, messy, beautiful struggle. She had let a mediocre man convince her she wasn't enough, and in her rage, she had burned down her entire world just to prove him wrong. She had won. She had absolutely destroyed David Miller. But watching those two strangers laugh in her old kitchen, Elena knew the horrifying truth. The revenge hadn't healed her. It had hollowed her out. David was ruined, yes, but he was still capable of breaking, of bleeding, of feeling desperate. Elena couldn't feel anything anymore. She had taken Arthur's advice. She had built the walls so thick that nothing could ever reach her again. "Thomas," Elena whispered, her voice trembling just a fraction before she forced it back into a flat, dead line. "Yes, Miss Elena." "Take us to the office. Tell the legal team I want the probate documents ready to sign the moment I walk through the door." "At once." The Maybach pulled away from the curb, leaving the warm yellow light of the apartment window behind in the rain. An hour later, Elena sat behind the massive mahogany desk in her corner office. The city stretched out below her, a sprawling grid of wet, glittering lights. It looked like a circuit board. It looked like a machine waiting for a command. The primary probate document sat in the center of the desk. A single heavy sheet of linen paper that would officially transfer sole ownership of the Vanderkamp Holdings empire to her name. No board approval required. Absolute, unchecked power. She picked up the matte black pen. The metal was cold against her skin. She thought of David somewhere in the city, reading a rejection letter, worrying about his rent. She thought of Arthur rotting in his velvet box. She thought of the girl who used to paint in the spare room and wear thrifted Chanel. That girl was dead too. Elena pressed the nib to the paper. The ink smelled like copper and burnt plastic. She signed her name in a sharp, jagged script that looked nothing like the soft loops of Elena Miller. C. Vanderkamp. She set the pen down. The office was utterly silent. She was the most powerful woman in the world, and she was at absolute zero. She turned her leather chair toward the floor-to-ceiling window, crossed her legs, and stared out into the freezing, empty dark. Did Elena make the right choice, or did she lose her soul to win a battle against a broken man? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If this story hooked, you hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more dark, grounded drama. Ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. Thanks for watching.